So hi everyone, my name's Rachel Holmes. I'm one of the founders of MetaSpace, which is a hub of health, wellness, and spirituality for those who work in Web3 technology within that community. And the speaker series, which is what this is an event we do every month and we open it up to anyone. So I always encourage the speaker to, you know, promote what they're going to talk about and we promote it within our community. But it's one of the ways we help bridge communities between health, wellness, and spirituality and what's happening in new technological advances. Um, so, welcome. Our guest today is Maria Wesserly. She's from Four Season Foraging in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and she'll be speaking with us today about restorative and sustainable practices around foraging. So I'll hand it over to her. Oh, one more thing before I do that. If you have a question, there's the electronic hand you can use on Zoom. So I know you have a question, and she knows you have a question. Otherwise, we just do a little hand signal so that we know you'd like to speak. And Maria, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thanks, Rachel, and thanks for inviting me here and for this opportunity. It's great to see you all. So thanks everyone for joining. Yeah, like Rachel said, I'm the founder of Four Season Foraging, which is a small business based in Minneapolis, Minnesota that teaches you to safely and sustainably identify and harvest wild edibles. So today we're focusing on the sustainably part, and I have a whole list here of things to talk about. So hopefully we'll get through everything. If not, that's okay too. I'm hoping for this to be a little more interactive and like a discussion. So like Rachel said, if you have something to say or have a question, please, either raise your physical hand or there's that little button down there that lets you raise a virtual hand. And yeah, just to start with, I kind of want to get a sense of where people are coming from, like physically and just your background with foraging. So is everyone coming from North America today? Or can you raise your hand or give a thumbs up if you're North America? Cool, sounds like it. Is there anyone not in North America? Anybody coming from Europe or Asia or maybe South America, Africa, Australia even? No, it doesn't look like it? Okay, cool. So yeah, like I said, I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I've lived in the Midwest most of my life, so that's where my primary knowledge lies in terms of different plant species. But the things I'm going to be talking about today are definitely applicable everywhere. So if you have something you want to share about things happening in your region, please feel free to do so. And then what are people's like experience level with foraging? Like, can you raise your hand if you're like a total beginner, like haven't even picked a blueberry off a bush? Or okay, you picked a blueberries at least. Oh, looks like Kelly, total beginner, totally fine. You gotta start from somewhere. What if you've done some foraging, like maybe a little bit in the backyard or kind of more like quote unquote normal plants, berries and nuts? Okay, yep, looks like it's where most people are at. Any like really experienced, knowledgeable foragers, people who've been doing it for years? Anyone? Yeah, one person in the corner there. Cool, sweet. So yeah, definitely, want to speak to all levels of experience. And again, if there's something you want to share about your personal experience, please do a little hand sign and we'll call on you. So, okay, so the first thing I want to talk about in general is what not to do when you're foraging in terms of sustainability. It's like, usually when you see this kind of list, it's easier to talk about what not to do versus what to do, just because I don't know why. That's just kind of the way it works. So these are, I have like a short list of things that are good to avoid. And I was just wondering if anyone has any ideas of, practices not to do, things to avoid if you're trying to forage sustainably. Okay, Rachel?
Well, I went foraging once with a guy in North Carolina who was a local expert specifically on mushrooms, and I think he was saying that there's like only like a certain percentage. Like if you find something that you want to forage, you should only take a certain percentage of what you find. Otherwise, you're kind of, you're not killing the plant, but I forget exactly the term he used, but it's not sustainable. Is how you kind of put it.
Yeah, definitely. So that's one of the things you don't want to do is pick too much of a plant or a mushroom or whatever it is you're harvesting. There's like some, general guidelines to follow depending on what you're picking. Like if you're picking leaves, then usually around like a third to half of the leaves you can pick off a plant and it'll be okay. And like with things like flowers or seeds or nuts or fruits, you can definitely harvest more. Just keep in mind that you want to leave enough so the plant can continue to reproduce, because we want the plant population to be sustained into future generations, and it needs to reproduce to be able to do that. And then if you're picking the root, then of course you have to dig up the whole plant and kill the plant. So with that, you want to generally pick a pretty small portion of the population. I would say usually no more than 25%. And like these guidelines, I just want to give a little disclaimer because like, don't get too hung up on the numbers. Like I definitely did that when I started foraging. I would read, a guide that said like, you can pick 2/3 of the leaves. And I'd be like, great. And just go out and pick all these leaves off of plants. And then I'd read another guide that says like, pick 1/3 of the leaves. And I'm like, oh no, like what have I done? So it really varies depending on the plant and depending on the locality, if you ask. So
Sorry, Maria, I accidentally muted you.
that's okay. Those are just kind of guidelines. And do people have any other ideas of things not to do?
I know they say don't eat mushrooms from the forest unless you're absolutely sure what you find, even if you are certain. There are like many different variances, but I don't know about the harvesting guidelines. I haven't heard I have heard that like mushrooms kind of like they give off spores more. Like you pick them up and you're like rummaging through them, and actually you're helping them spread their thing around. So harvesting mushrooms is actually good for the mushroom.
Yeah, so mushrooms are an interesting thing because they're, completely different from plants, completely different from animals. They're their own kingdom. So, there's like the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, there's like different bacterial kingdoms. So mushrooms actually reproduce, like you said, by spores. And the part of the mushroom that we pick is the fruiting body. So it's more like an apple on a tree than like, pulling up a plant by the root. So there's this whole, it's called the mycelium that's underneath the soil or the substrate, whatever it is. It could be, straw, or it could be wood. The mycelial network runs through there, and that's like the body of the mushroom, like the trunk of the tree. So there is a little bit of controversy. Most people say you can just rip the mushroom up and it's fine. Some people say like use a knife so you don't disturb the mycelium. But one thing that a lot of people say is use like a mesh bag or something that's breathable. So as you're walking through, the spores can get dispersed. Whereas, if you're using like a plastic bag, for example, the spores just all fall in the plastic bag and they can't be dispersed through the forest. So using something like mesh or like an onion bag or something like that is really good for mushrooms. And yeah, you definitely want to know what the plant is for, edibility purposes. Like you don't want to eat something that's poisonous or that could hurt you. But also for sustainability purposes, like if like, let's say you go in the woods and you're like, see a plant and you're like, oh, I think that it's whatever, X, Y, and Z plant. I think that is, you know, fiddlehead fern, for example. I think I can eat that. And you pick like a ton of it, you know, you just like fill your basket. And then you get home and you do the ID and you're like, oh, this isn't actually what I thought it was. It's not edible. This all goes in the trash. You know, that's not a sustainable way to harvest. Like, if you're not sure what a plant is, you can just pick a little bit so that you can take it home and identify it. And then if it is something edible, you can go back later and pick more of it. And also if it's like a plant you haven't eaten yet, you might find that you don't enjoy the taste. And I do definitely encourage people to, you know, eat plants more than once because they can taste different depending on like where they're growing and the time of year and all kinds of different factors. But like, for example, I remember, so this example is with burdock, which, are people familiar with burdock at all? Yeah, a little bit. Well, it's that plant that it often grows like along trail sides and vacant lots and kind of disturbed areas. And it's non-native, it's from Eurasia. So, and it's like very prolific. So you can actually pick as much of it as you want and it's fine. But in this particular instance, oh, and it's burdock is the one with all the little like round brown burrs on it that get stuck like in your hair and in your dog's fur and stuff. But anyway, I was reading about eating burdock leaves and I was like, okay, I'm gonna pick a bunch of burdock leaves and try to cook these up and eat them. Turns out they're horribly bitter. I don't know who in their right mind would call them edible because like they're just awful. It's like the kind of thing where it like sucks your mouth of all like moisture and it's just, you know, your mouth is all dry and cottony and it's just awful. So I ended up throwing most of it away, which in this case was actually okay because burdock, like I said, grows everywhere. But let's say it was something that's more of a sensitive plant or something that has less of a distribution, then I would be wasting all that plant. And even if it is, you know, something that grows everywhere, I still try to be respectful and not throw away any of the plant matter. So yeah, hope that all makes sense. And then there's one more thing that I want to tell people not to do. Can anyone think of what it might be?
Rip the roots of the plant out of the ground?
Sometimes, yeah, it depends on the plant. Like with burdock, for example, the root is generally considered the tastiest part. I think, yeah, probably the best part. And you know, dandelion is another example. Queen Anne's lace, they're all very prolific plants where you could go out every day and pick as much of the root as you possibly can, and there would still be thousands of plants. So that depends. But the one last thing I wanted to mention was not to harvest sensitive species. So in particular, I'm talking about species listed as threatened or endangered. Threatened and endangered species are actually legally not allowed to pick. And there's also another category called species of special concern, which there aren't any laws around that. At least in Minnesota, there's no laws around species of special concern, but it's still a good thing to look at because, you know, it's something that it basically means it's something they're monitoring because they're worried it might end up being threatened or endangered. And to find these lists, you can go, I would look at like your state DNR, like for example, the Minnesota DNR website has a long list of all the threatened, endangered, and species of special concern. There's also the US Fish and Wildlife Service has the list of all the endangered species, threatened species, and candidates. So again, the candidates, there's no legal rules around that, but it's still things that are declining in population. Rachel, I see you have a question or comment.
What does DNR stand for?
Oh, sorry, it's the Department of Natural Resources. Yeah, and I have a list of resources, I can copy and paste those into chat. I haven't talked about all of them yet, but I'll just put it here. So yeah, I have the Minnesota DNR link in there and the endangered species info from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I also included United Plant Savers on there. Has anyone heard of that? United Plant Savers? Yeah, Rachel. So I believe they're a nonprofit group that, oh, and someone else down there, yay, Liz. So United Plant Savers has a list of, they focus on medicinal plants that are native to, I think, North America. I think they do US and Canada. Yeah, US and Canada. And so if you're thinking about harvesting something, you can check out that page. And in that link, I have in the text I just copied in the chat, it's the link directly to the at-risk species. So yeah, there's things on there like, golden seal and ginseng and a lot of other wild plants that are just facing, they tend to get over harvested because there's a commercial market for them. All right, so any questions about that part, what not to do? Questions, comments, concerns? All right, cool. So we can move on to the opposite of that, which is what should you do? And this is, it's a little harder to put this into words. It's pretty easy to make a list of like, don't pick endangered plants, don't harvest more than you can use, like, et cetera, et cetera. But the things that you should do and the practices you should follow are kind of they can just be, a little more intangible in some cases. But does anybody have any good ideas of what might be a good practice to follow for sustainability? Anybody? All right, well, I'll start, excuse me, I'll start talking about it. And if something comes to mind, definitely feel free to raise your hand or speak up. So the first thing I'll say is just kind of the opposite of don't pick sensitive species, which is do pick invasive plants, non-native plants, prolific plants, weedy plants. There are a ton of plants out there that are edible. And really, no matter where you live, like I live in Minneapolis, I am in an apartment that's pretty close to downtown. It's like, a very urban area. If I go in the front yard here, I can probably find like, well, maybe not right now because there's not a lot of plants up, but in a few weeks, I would be able to find probably 10 different edible weeds just growing in the yard. So things like dandelion, we've all heard of dandelion, right? So that's a great wild edible. Plantain, not the banana, but the broadleaf plantain, it's another common weed. It's edible and it's also used for like bee stings and burns, and it's used to draw out poisons. It's a great medicinal plant too that also just grows everywhere. And yeah, there's tons of examples. I mentioned burdock earlier, and there's also so many invasive plants that I know invasive plants can be like a touchy subject with some people or be kind of controversial, but there's some non-native plants that don't really like disturb native ecosystems that much, right? Like they tend to just hang out in, vacant lots and disturb areas. Like you'll find them, for example, along roadsides or like growing up through cracks in the sidewalk or that kind of thing. But then there's also other plants that are actually highly invasive and will take over prairies or oak savannas or woodlands and just decimate the native population. So like in those instances, and really in both instances, it's great to pick as much of those plants as you can. And especially with plants that are actually invasive, like picking them even if you're not planning to eat them, just because they spread so quickly and there's not really a concerted effort to get rid of them. Like in some parks, you know, they'll have volunteer picking days or they'll like spray herbicides or something like that, but it's, I would say, very much piecemeal. So one of those examples that grows around here is garlic mustard. Is anyone familiar with that, or have you heard of garlic mustard? I see a few, yes, a few know. So garlic mustard is a mustard, as the name implies. So it's an edible plant and it has a garlicky taste, as the name implies. But it's a European native and it started out on the East Coast and has since spread across much of the much of North America. But it just tends to really take over the woodland floor. So where before you might have a really diverse ecosystem of like many different, looks like someone's chatting. So someone's favorite invasive removal initiative, Boise Goat Head Fest. Oh, goat herds. Oh, wow. What? Goat head. Interesting. I'm not familiar with that one. Goat head. Wow. Yeah, so garlic mustard, you know, where before you might have things like spring beauty and bloodroot and, you know, black cohosh and all these different native ephemeral sensitive plants. Now it'll just be like, it can get to the point where it's 70% garlic mustard just on the forest floor. So in the places I've lived in like a few rural areas in Michigan, both in northern and central Michigan. And also now where I live here in Minneapolis, I make a huge effort to pick as much garlic mustard as I can. And you can also eat it. So if, you know, you can pick it just for the like ecological purposes, but you can also pick it to eat it. And I've actually done a class, a few classes actually in coordination with the Minneapolis Parks and Rec Board, where we went out and picked up a bunch of garlic mustard, and then we made like garlic mustard pesto, we made garlic mustard hummus, you know, we cooked different things with it and ate it together. And I just, you know, I really like that as a method of invasive species control. You know, you're not spraying dangerous chemicals. You're encouraging people to continue to harvest the invasive species because they then get to eat it, right? So yeah, I really like that method. Another invasive species that folks here might be familiar with is kudzu, which is a vine. People heard of that? Yes, yeah. It's mostly in the south and the southeast, but also there's some populations like in the northwest. Yes, sorry, how do you pronounce your name?
Yaler.
Okay.
How did kudzu get here? Where did it come from? And like, what do we do about? Because I've seen it. Like, we live in North Carolina in Asheville, and it grows everywhere all over the forest there. And you can even see trees that have died because of its thing. So, like, how did kudzu get here? Where did it come from?
Yeah, so it's an Asian plant. I want to say it's native to Japan, but I'm not 100% positive, but somewhere in East Asia. And I can't remember exactly how it came here, but basically through trade, you know, we have international trade and things just accidentally get dropped off. And then in this case, because the habitat is so perfect for it, it just kind of takes over. And yeah, like you said, it's like it's highly invasive, highly prolific. It will just, like, you can see a whole mountainside that's just covered in kudzu vines. Like, it'll just engulf entire trees. And yeah, it is very, very hard to control. You can eat it. So the root, and I haven't eaten it before, but the root, the leaves, the tips, and the flowers are edible. The vines are not. So I would just like do some more research into that. So, like, you know, if everybody was out picking and eating kudzu, that would at least put a dent in the population. I think the current methods of eradication are just like herbicide, which, you know, obviously has a limited effect because we can see that kudzu is still everywhere. And also, as I was saying, there's just not really a comprehensive plan to combat invasive species. Like, there really needs to be something that's more coordinated, so that we're getting it everywhere that it grows, not just on like certain parklands that are deemed more important than others. So yeah, to answer your question, as of now, there is not a great way to deal with kudzu, unfortunately. And I would just say, yeah, it requires more of a comprehensive, like, coordinated effort. And of course, you can go out and pick it and, you know, do what you can in your day-to-day life, but we need obviously more people doing it, and support from like government and nonprofits and stuff.
What are the long-term consequences if we don't do anything about it at all? Is there any research on that? Or like, what if we just 150 years let it go loose? Like, does it balance itself back out? What's your thought there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we don't, right. So it hasn't been here 150 years yet. It arrived fairly recently. I would have to look up the date. I want to say like in the 80s, maybe the 90s. So it hasn't been here that long. It's been like a few decades.
It's already killing trees.
Yes.
So
yeah.
does it basically, sorry, does it suffocate the trees? Is that how that happens? Or like,
yeah. So it just like, yep, because it's super fast growing and it's like really dense and it can just like cover the whole tree. And so it's like, you know, taking all the sunlight, and underneath is just like really, there's not a lot of sunlight that gets through. So then the plants and trees and things underneath there just slowly die. Let's see, I'm trying to look this up. So it's native to East Asia.
It does sound Japanese. Hatsu?
Yeah, it does, right?
It is. I know that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to see how long it's been here. But I mean, anyway, the oh, I guess it was introduced in 1876. Whoa. In the
That's
Centennial
wild.
Exposition in Philadelphia. I didn't know it was that long ago.
That's
And
really
then
It's getting there. We're getting there. Half 150.
yeah. And then it says in the 30s and 40s, the vine was used as a way for farmers to stop soil erosion. So that's also unfortunately another common thing we see with a lot of different invasives, like honeysuckle, for example, and autumn olive. They are all used, or were all originally used for soil erosion. But I guess just like speaking from my opinion would be that it would, you know, where it wasn't controlled, it would smother out the native ecosystems and just leave a, I mean, it would leave a kind of broken up patchwork of plants that includes kudzu and probably some other like non-native plants that are more hardy. And yeah, I don't know off the top of my head, like which, if any, native plants are more tolerant of it. Yeah, I don't see any information about that, but basically it is, and if it was able to continue spreading, it would continue to dramatically hurt the ecosystem. Because yeah, there are a lot of really sensitive woodland species that need really certain habitats and that like evolved to live in this plant community, not just plant community, but community of, different insects and mammals and all the other things. And so when you bring in a foreign thing that's just taking over the majority of the ecosystem, then it becomes hard for those other things to live. Rachel?
So for us to find out what species in our region are invasive, would that be on the DNR website too?
Yeah, it should be on there. If you just, do a search for like your state and invasive species, you'll come up with a list. And usually the lists that I see are like they are more on the side of including everything, like if you looked up invasive species in Minnesota, it would probably include like dandelion and burdock and Queen Anne's lace and a lot of things that I guess could be called invasive, but you don't see them like growing in the middle of a healthy forest. Whereas with like kudzu or garlic mustard or other similar species, you do see that. And then there's also like, right, because, prairies, for example, and oak savannas are really, they're highly endangered ecosystems and they're very rare. So, if you have, obviously, there's not a lot of like true prairie left. In Minnesota, in the southwest part, we have more prairie and like oak savanna and stuff. But so anyways, you get things like autumn olive, which is like a invasive shrub that just comes in and takes over the prairie. Or things like spotted knapweed that just come in and displace native plants. So yeah, and not all of them are edible. Autumn olive, the berries are actually edible, but spotted knapweed is not. But yeah, you can find that list definitely online, and I would assume on the DNR websites. All right. Any other question about that or comments? Okay. So the next thing I'll say is do research on the wild edibles that you're harvesting. So I kind of, oh, bye Sam, thanks for coming. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but when I was talking about like how many leaves you can pick off a plant or how many flowers you can pick and that kind of thing, just saying that there isn't really one number that you can stick to and apply equally to all plants. You have to, it depends on the region, it depends on the specific plant. So definitely research the plants, get to know the plants that you're harvesting, learn things about your ecosystem. Spending time outside can definitely help with that. Just kind of getting more familiar with what's around you and your landscape. And I'll just give a few examples here of a few different plants that are kind of defy logic when anyway, you'll see. I'll get into it. So I'll start with ramps / wild leeks. This is the Latin name Allium tricoccum. Are people familiar with this? It's like a native woodland plant. Yeah, I see a few head nods. It's become more popular in, like you'll see it more in restaurants and specialty stores and at farmers markets, and the demand for it has really increased in the last few decades. And so when I lived in Michigan, there was a lot of ramps around. There's a lot of ramps around here in Minnesota too, but I live in the city, so obviously I'm not as close to them. But especially when I lived in northern Michigan, the property I lived on, it was like, I think like 200 acres, and like half of it was like beech maple forest, and it just in the spring had like a beautiful, wonderful amount of different wildflowers that would come up, and there'd just be like acres and acres of ramps, you know, just. And for those who don't know, ramps, they're like a type of wild onion. They're also called wild leek. They're in the allium genus, which is the same as like onions and garlic. And they grow out of this little bulb, and in the spring they produce these two flowers that look kind of like tulip flowers. So in the springtime is usually when you go harvest them, and what you see mostly in the markets and what the demand is for is the bulbs. So you can like, you know, dig them up with a shovel or use like a trowel. And yeah, so I would, you know, I was like, wow, there's tons of these leeks out here. I'll just like go out and dig as many as I want, and it's totally cool. And after doing this for a couple of years, someone told me like, oh, you know, leeks are like a really sensitive plant. And they're like, you know, they're not on like an endangered species list or anything, but they're being threatened by overharvesting. And I was kind of like, haha, like good joke. Like, you know, these grow everywhere. What are you talking about? But as it turns out, that is actually true. So I didn't do my due diligence and like do research into the plant. I just saw it growing everywhere and assumed that it was okay to pick as much as I wanted. But actually it's a native perennial and it's extremely slow growing. So it can take up to 7 years for it to produce a seed. And mostly it reproduces not by seed, but like vegetatively, like basically making little clones of itself. So you'll often see them growing in clumps, and that's like how they are reproducing, is they're kind of like spreading out by the bulbs. And yeah, so when you pick it, it takes a long time for it to refill the spot that you just picked. And this is data from the United Plant Savers website. It says that if an entire population is harvested, it could take 150 years for it to fully recover. And I've looked up other like other articles and research into it on, I linked it on here, scholar.google.com is a good resource if you're trying to find like peer-reviewed, like scholarly articles. And I've seen figures around like 1.5% harvest is what's sustainable if you're harvesting the bulbs. So very, very low. And what I've since learned is that the most sustainable way to harvest leeks, wild leeks or ramps, is to just pick one of the single leaves off of it. So like I said, in the spring, it has these like two leaves that come off, kind of like a tulip. And if you just pick one of those and it has the other leaf left to photosynthesize, and it can continue to grow, and you're not putting pressure on the plant because the bulb will still be there. It's a perennial, it comes back year after year. Whereas if you go in, you know, with a shovel and you're digging up a bunch of it, that will take a long time to refill that area. You know, if you happen to be on private land where you know that no one else is picking it, you can go in, I would recommend, with a trowel and do like very minimal harvesting of the bulbs. And like I said, like things I've read have said like 1.5%. So very, very small harvesting. But definitely the safer way to do it is just to pick one leaf off of each ramp. So that's one example. I have two more examples. Let's see, how much time do we have left? We have like 15 minutes. Do people have any questions about that before I go on? Okay. So the next example I have is sweetgrass. And Are people familiar with that plant? This is another plant that has more commercial pressure on it, and you see it. So it's a plant that's often used among used among Native American people for traditional, for example, like smudging is one of the purposes, and making baskets is another one. I think it might have some medicinal qualities as well. I'm not sure on that. But it's a plant that grows in the prairies. So like the Dakotas, you'll find it in. And actually here it is right here. This is sweetgrass. This is a book that I linked in the recommendations called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall-Kimmerer. It's really great. And this story actually comes from this book. And I put that book in, the list of recommendations. She just has a really great philosophy about like foraging and relationship to the land and that kind of thing. But so in this story, they talk about sweetgrass and how it's been disappearing from its traditional range, which, like I said, is, it's a prairie plant, so like in the Dakotas. And there's a botanist, Lori Reed, and then Robin Wall-Kimmerer as well, decided to study the different harvesting methods, because there's two main different harvesting methods that are traditional among the Dakota people. And one of them involves actually pulling up the plant by the root, and the other one is like breaking off the stem near the base of the plant so that you're not disturbing the root. So one disturbs the root, one doesn't. But both of them, in both methods, they take less than half of what they see. And, they give gratitude, they leave offerings of tobacco. They're respectful about how much they take. So they wanted to know, like, is one method better than the other? Are both these methods like disrupting the population? What's going on here? So they brought the proposal to the faculty at the university and got actually a lot of negative feedback and a lot of criticism, saying like, oh, this answer is obvious. Why do you need to study this? This isn't scientific, kind of criticisms. However, they were able to go through with it. So they had 3 different plots. One which was undisturbed, so that was the control plot. And then one where they followed the one harvesting method of, taking no more than half, but pulling up the plant by the root. And then the third one, they followed the other harvesting method. So again, taking no more than half, but being careful not to disturb the root. So just breaking off the grass at the base. And they got really clear answers. Does anyone want to venture a guess what the results were? Nobody? Any brave soul? Okay. So the results surprised everybody except for the indigenous folks. The results were that the undisturbed plot, so the control plot that was not picked from at all, was the plot that was struggling and had very few sweetgrass plants surviving in it. The other 2 plots that were harvested, both were thriving. They didn't show any favorable sign toward one harvesting method or another, but both of them were doing really well. The plants were flourishing, and it was just like clear as day. So this is, an example of where, like, we are often taught that, human impact is bad and human interaction with nature is bad. But I believe that, humans are a part of nature. It's a false dichotomy, this like human versus nature distinction. And in this example, we can see how humans can have a really positive impact on the ecosystem by interacting with it, not by leaving it alone or like treating it like a museum that actually really hurts the plant in this case. So they weren't able to, they had some theories on why the disturbance might help, Like the plant, for example, it's, like I said, it's a native prairie plant, so it's used to disturbance. Like, you know, there used to be millions of buffalo that would trample on it and eat it and stuff. So they kind of just theorize that, you know, this is what it evolved with and this is what it thrives in. And therefore, as humans, we can follow this practice to help it. So I really like that story. And then I have one final example with that. And then I have a couple other things to mention. The other example I wanted to bring up is common milkweed. So are people familiar with the milkweed plant? You might know it because of monarch butterflies. Okay, so monarchs, as folks probably know, have been in decline, and there's been a huge push to help them by growing milkweed plants. And that's because milkweed is the host plant for monarch butterfly eggs. So monarch butterflies will only lay their eggs on milkweed, and then the eggs hatch and the caterpillars will only eat the milkweed. So milkweed happens to be a great edible species. I'm not going to get into that here, but that's something you can research. It's a great wild edible. And, you know, I hear a lot of criticism, and other foragers hear a lot of criticism about, like, oh, you shouldn't pick milkweed, you should leave it alone. Like the monarchs need it, like you're damaging the ecosystem, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing is with milkweed, this has actually been researched. This is from the University of Michigan, and I'll just read some statistics. So the thing with milkweed is that the new shoots, so the shoot is just like when the plant first comes up out of the ground, and it's kind of, you know, shaped like a beanpole or like asparagus, kind of think like that, like when asparagus first comes out, and it's just like this straight thing growing out of the earth. So with milkweed, the monarch caterpillars actually prefer the new shoots, so the new growth. So what they've been finding, and this isn't just the University of Michigan, this is cited in other places as well, is that if you cut down the milkweed in early summer or late spring, and then allow for a second round of it to grow, because like milkweed is a perennial, it has a root that's like, you know, starchy and comes back year after year. So it will survive like a cutting, it will just grow right back. So what they found is that the new shoots are highly attractive to female monarchs, receiving 2 to 10 times more eggs than older stems. And the new shoots also harbor fewer predators. So the survival of eggs and young larvae was 2 to 2.5 times higher on regrowing stems. And they also found that there's some importance with older stems, like as the caterpillars mature, they'll move from the younger stems to the older ones. So maintaining like a diversity in milkweed ages seems to be important. But regardless, what they're saying is it's better to actually pick the milkweed, or some of the milkweed at least, and to have it regrow than to just like leave it completely undisturbed, which again is contrary to what people assume. Like they think just leave it alone. The butterflies need it, the monarchs need it, but like I'm saying, this study shows that the disturbance is actually good for the ecosystem. So yeah, sometimes, you know, plants really like disturbance and sometimes they really don't like it. It really depends on the plant, and therefore researching plants is a good idea. All right, so just 2 more things I wanted to say. One is monitor the areas you harvest from and alter your harvesting practices if necessary. So this, you know, requires a connection to the land. You have to be able to check on the area fairly frequently, and you have to have a pretty good knowledge of what was there before you started harvesting, and you know, what you would expect to be there and what are signs of a healthy ecosystem and that kind of thing. So it requires a little bit of background knowledge, but it's definitely a good habit to get into. And then the final thing I'll say is to, and this is a really kind of vague general thing, but to follow restorative practices. So I will just mention this book, Incredible Wild Edibles by Sam Thayer. It's another book I put in the chat as a resource. Sam Thayer is a great wild food author. He has several books and they're all really great for learning about wild edibles, but he also tends to just write about other things that are related to wild edibles. Definitely the bulk of it is about like identification, harvesting, that kind of thing. But like in the beginning of the book, for example, he has guidelines for sustainable gathering, which are like, it's probably the best, like in terms of being both concise and comprehensive, like the best list of guidelines I've seen for sustainable gathering. And then he has like some essays on wild food. There's one that's called Does Foraging Destroy Nature, which I think is relevant to what we're talking about today. And then the thing I really wanted to mention was in the back, he has this big chapter all about ecoculture is what he calls it. So he coined that term, but it's describing a practice that's ancient and that indigenous people still follow, and that probably has been done since the dawn of humanity, really, which basically is, so ecoculture is kind of in contrast to agriculture, where with agriculture, you like strip the land of what's there, you get it down to just the soil, and then you put in the seeds or whatever you want. Whereas with ecoculture, you look at what's there and you're like, okay, I know this and this and this and this is edible and I want to encourage it. So I'm gonna, do whatever, do some selective weeding or do some selective burning or whatever would help encourage those plants. And yeah, we'll see this as an example, like, when Europeans first colonized the Americas, they came here and they're like, oh, it's this vast wilderness and it's like beautiful, but it was actually filled with indigenous people who lived here for a long, long time, and people who tended to the wilderness. So, what they saw as wilderness was, it was wilderness, I would say it was, but it was manicured by indigenous people and tended in such a way so that it creates like a balanced ecosystem, but also so that it has lots of food and products that are useful to people. So for example, like burning pine barrens so that a lot of blueberries grow. So he, in this essay, is basically arguing for that kind of a food system that's more based on what's in the wild and just like encouraging things that are already in the wild to grow versus, chopping down all the trees, clearing out all the plants, and then putting in wheat and potatoes or whatever. And I guess I'll say, like, when you read it, if you read it, and you can also search for it online. He has some like podcasts and stuff where he talks about it, but he can come across as like kind of overly zealous, but I really like the direction that he's taking and the gist of what he's saying. So anyways, just kind of keep that in mind. Rachel.
Yeah, I just want to see if anyone has questions, or just making sure everyone is getting like what they want to know out of this, because we didn't ask that in the beginning. But so if there are any questions or anything that you like, oh, there's still this lingering thought, I'm still unsure about this thing, I just want to make sure we have time for that.
I cannot hear that person. Can anyone else?
It was my fault. Hello.
Oh, there
Thank
you
you.
go.
I have a question about like, I am in the Twin Cities also, and like resources for finding good spots to forage, like especially for like fun items like mushrooms and ramps and berries. Like I've seen some like Facebook groups and stuff, but no one is really willing to share their locations. It's just, which I get, but like it's also kind of frustrating as a beginner.
Yeah, I totally hear that. I will put a link into my website. I don't have like specific locations in my website. But I do have, let's see. Ooh, okay.
Or just like tips for finding location. Like I don't need an address, but it's just kind of overwhelming.
Yeah, so in this link here, resources I have, if you click on urban foraging or rural foraging, there's like recommendations on places to go. So in Minneapolis, you're legally allowed to pick a small number of fruit and nut species from the Minneapolis parks. There are a few restricted areas, like, for example, the bird sanctuary and like golf courses and places like that. So I have a link to that document if you go to urban foraging on that link I just provided. And then rural foraging will also have some ideas of where to go, like state parks and national parks and that kind of thing. Because, yeah, I mean, with the legality, it does get tricky. I try to encourage people to follow the laws in foraging. It's kind of a do what I say, not what I do kind of thing, because I definitely, I will, for example, pick garlic mustard from the parks, and it's like, that's totally illegal, but ecologically it makes sense, so I'm going to do it anyway. And yeah, and like, it's from what I've seen, there's no place legally where you can pick greens or roots. So like ramps or fiddlehead ferns or that kind of thing, you would have to go to private property. State parks and state forests, they usually allow harvesting of fruits and nuts and mushrooms. Another good resource if you're interested in mushrooms is the Minnesota Mycological Society. They do forays out in the state parks. I think with COVID, they've been doing like more online stuff, but maybe hopefully soon they'll do stuff out in the woods again.
I have a quick follow-up question. If someone else wants to jump in, that's fine too. But with like urban stuff and like you mentioned dandelions in your yard or plantain or whatever, do you worry about like soil toxicity in the city?
Yes. Yeah. Contamination is really a thing you have to think about. Even in rural areas, it's something you have to be careful about. But of course, in the city, there are lots of opportunity for contamination. And I do, somewhere on my website, I think it's in my blog, have like an article about avoiding contamination. It's kind of, there's kind of a lot there. In terms of avoiding contamination, it's kind of a lot of different things to do, but the most basic thing is just wash the thing before you eat it, because mostly when people ingest contaminants is because there's contaminated soil on the thing they're eating. It's not because the thing they're eating actually absorbed the contaminants like within itself. And then another suggestion is like, pick stuff like fruits and nuts and berries, because those typically absorb less contaminants than things like greens or stems or roots.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Maria?
Yeah, I got to run, but I just want to say thanks so much for coming and sharing your knowledge with us. It was awesome to hear about all the interesting things.
Well, thanks for joining.
Yes, thanks, Maria, for speaking with us. And I'll send everyone a copy of the video in case, because I know some people couldn't make it at this time, that if there's any information you want to remind yourself of, you'll have the video to look at again.
Yay.
All right, everyone. Thank you for coming again and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.